Welcome to Merryn Talks Your Money, the personal finance edition of Merryn Talks Money. In these bonus podcasts, we talk about the best strategies for making the most of your money. I'm John Stepek, senior reporter for Bloomberg and author of the award-winning, in fact, multi-award-winning Money Distilled newsletter. Now, Merryn's out this week, but instead I'm going to be joined by pensions expert Tom McPhail, a friend of the show. Tom spent almost 20 years at Hargreaves Lansdown, 15 of those as their head of retirement policy. He's also a trustee director of a very large final salary DB pension scheme, which I just said I thought would be absolutely fascinating, and then caught myself and thought, my goodness, I used to be cool. But anyway, enough of that. And he's a freelance media contributor discussing all things pensions. Thanks very much for joining me today, Tom.
Thank you, John.
Now, obviously, one of the reasons we've got you on the show today is because there's a little thing, the November budget coming up in 2 months' time, and there's going to be an awful lot of speculation between now and then. But one particularly interesting thing we've talked a lot about is the potential impact on pensions. And obviously, a lot of people have been scrambling to try and get ahead of potential changes. Now, nothing we say on this show is personal financial advice, just to be very, very clear. And you always have to think about your own circumstances. But my eye was caught the other day by an article you wrote in which you said you are going to take your 25% tax-free lump sum out of your pension ahead of the budget. And I thought it was quite an interesting rationale. So shall we have a wee chat about that, and you can explain to the readers, or listeners rather, what it was that drove this decision and how you thought about it?
Sure, absolutely. And through that process, hopefully we can emphasise that just because I've done it, it doesn't mean everybody should. My circumstances are quite particular. You guys have talked already about the political context, but I think it's worth just briefly revisiting that.
Yeah.
For the last 20, 25 years, certainly post-2008, pretty much every budget, there's been that, I wonder what rules are going to change. I wonder what allowances they're going to take away. I wonder what restrictions they're going to impose. And particularly once we got into the coalition years, there was a series of budgets where they chipped away at the pension allowances. So, there is some form here. And we didn't always know in advance what it was going to be, but I think the particular situation we're in now, after Rachel Reeves' budget last year, a very substantial increase in borrowing.
Yeah.
Currently running a deficit around 5%. There's debt to GDP is currently at around 100%. So there's a real squeeze on the government. So I think that context is relevant. I think it's also relevant to point out that Torsten Bell, who I've met a couple of times and know reasonably well, and I've read his book, which, by the way, I would recommend. It's a really interesting and well-read book. I disagreed with almost everything in it, but it's genuinely a well-written and interesting book. But he is clearly not averse to the idea of taxing wealth. The government has done a wealth tax as such, but where is the wealth? It is in the pension system. And he has talked in his Resolution Foundation days about capping the tax-free lump sum at £40,000, which is a really swinging cut. The IFS talked about cutting it to £100,000. It's not even as if the government's the only ones thinking in these kind of terms. So I think that context is relevant. If ever there was a moment when a government was going to come along and restrict the pensions tax-free cash, certainly now, more than any time I've been working in pensions, it feels like the moment. That context really made me feel deeply uncomfortable. And then there's my particular personal circumstances, John. I'm 59. I'm only working part-time now. So I'm going to tap into my pensions pretty soon anyway. And I think a really crucial point here is, because I've been pretty lucky in life, I cannot accrue any more tax-free cash. So however much more my pension pot grows, the amount of tax-free cash I get out of it is always going to stay the same. They've frozen that limit. Yeah. And all the growth in my pension pot in the future is going to be taxable when I draw the money out. And then in addition, they've just announced they're going to take away the inheritance tax exemption on pension pots from 2027. I'm only 59 now. If I live until I'm 75, then even if the money suffers further taxation when it gets passed on to any beneficiaries. So, the tax context has already changed. That then led me to the realization that, well, look, if it's a trade-off between leaving the money in the pension pot and potentially suffering tens of thousands of pounds of extra tax if they reduce the allowance, or taking it out of the pension pot now, reinvesting it over the next few years in ISAs between myself and my wife, where it will then continue to grow tax-free, and from where we can draw on it tax-free, actually pretty quickly, I'm going to be ahead of the game. I use an IFA, by the way, and I would encourage others to do the same. So, he and I sat down and talked it through together, and he ran a spreadsheet for me. And the numbers were pretty clear that within a few years, I would be better off for taking the tax-free cash out now and putting it into my ISA. Because I'm only working part-time now, I'm no longer generating the kind of surplus income that would allow me and my wife to keep filling up our ISA allowances. So those allowances are going begging. But if I take the money out of my pension, I can then use up those allowances. So there's a whole load of factors there that really came together to make this a pretty simple decision for me.
I think that point about the reduction, so at the moment the tax-free allowance is just over £268,000. So if they were to reduce that even to the 100,000, let alone the 40k that Torsten had previously suggested, then I mean that is a massive, massive loss there. So but I think your point about sitting down with someone and going through a spreadsheet and working out where your break-even point, if you like, or your pain point is, makes a lot of sense. Because obviously the flip side of this is the fact that if you do take it out and she doesn't change it, then that means you are going to have this problem of, well, okay, what do I do with the money just now? Because obviously the annual ISA allowance is £20,000, so even between two people, that's still only 40,000, which means it still takes quite a while to get that money reinvested. And in the meantime, you are going to be liable for tax on any kind of growth in that money. So I think that's the key downside to think about, isn't it, on the other side of this calculation?
John, it could be worse than that, because I mean, the worst case scenario is I take this money out of my pension, which I am doing, and then they wrong foot me by saying, you know what, we're not going to reduce the pension tax-free allowance. Yes. What we're going to do is cap off the amount you can put in your ISAs. And that would be disappointing, because then I'd have this big bag of money in my bank account and I'd have no tax-free shelter to put it into. I don't think they're going to reduce either the annual allowance, or Torsten Bell again has talked in the past about, I think he suggested 100,000, capping off the maximum amount you can ISA. I don't think they're going to do that, but I'm not ignorant of the risks I'm taking in making this decision. It could go really badly for me, and if it does, you can all get on X and send me tweets telling me. Let's hope that our listeners don't do that. But I think it's just really important to understand that it's very clear that this does suit you, and you've weighed up the risks and rewards. But again, it's suitable for yourself, not necessarily for everyone else. Needs to think through their own circumstances. But I think the way you've described that and the thought process behind it makes a lot of sense. In terms of if you're a mere strip of a lad like me and actually not at the point where you could take your lump sum even if you wanted to, what should people like me be thinking about before the budget rolls around? Because I don't know about you, but to my mind, this is one of the least. I mean, obviously, before every budget, there's always an element of uncertainty, but this time, just as with the last time, it sort of feels as if almost anything could happen, and there isn't really much that's kind of off, completely off limits. So in terms of, is there anything at all that you can do as a current saver, or a current pensioner to, I don't know, insulate your money against what might happen on November the 26th? Really good question, John, and there are limited options available to us. And my worry is that I've talked about the pension tax-free lump sum, the pension commencement lump sum. There are other tax breaks available to pension savers, which could come under pressure for government. The overall tax relief the government grants on pensions every year is in the order of £70 billion. So the obvious thing is the pension contribution tax relief that you get for putting money into a pension. Then there's the national insurance contribution relief. Employers put money into a pension. There's no national insurance liability on that. The money's growing tax-free in the pension pot. So if you've got surplus cash that you are thinking of putting aside for retirement, it's a no-brainer to do it ahead of the budget rather than after.
And just moving on to kind of other options, is what else do you think we should be watching out for? I mean, obviously they've changed the inheritance tax situation on pensions and on AIM stocks and on farms. That's another area that people get very concerned about. Do you think they'll make any further moves on that front?
Oh, John, so I was talking to some farmers yesterday down at a sheep auction, as you do in my part of the world. I too am living the dream, and they are incandescent with rage about the IHT changes. I don't think down in Westminster they quite realise maybe they do and they just don't care, but the entire farming community is absolutely up in arms about what they've done on the inheritance tax. I don't see any sign of the government softening their position on that. I think that one is a done deal. Also, you look at the private school VAT change, which was introduced mid-year. So I think where the government feels it is ideologically appropriate to do so, they're not shy of imposing taxes. They're bending over backwards to try and preserve their manifesto promise of not raising income tax, VAT and national insurance, though we can argue about whether they honoured that promise on the employer's NI. But it's about protecting workers, and where does that leave them? It's about taxing wealth.
I think everyone would agree there are sensible things that could be done with particularly council tax reform, or the way that we tax property generally. And I think the only thing the thing I'm more concerned about is that a lot of the measures are just slapping extra complexities on rather than trying to step back and do a full-scale reform, which I suspect would just require more time than the government feels it has for some reason.
And so much of tax and regulatory reform in this country is just additive. It's not reform. It's just another layer of regulation or another layer of tax onto an existing and already fiendishly complicated system. And again, I would speak up in Torsten Bell's defence. He argued in his book for fundamental reform of the UK's tax code, that it has become hugely Byzantine and bureaucratic and inefficient and incoherent.
This is a slightly, not off-topic question, but a slightly bigger question or macro question. Do you think that the government is a little bit too worried about the reaction of the bond market in that context? Because I sometimes think that if you could stand up there and tell a decent story about how they were going to take 6 months, a year to do a big review of this particular area of tax, or this area of spending, more importantly, for example, on the disability benefits side of things, and say, we're not cutting anything just now, but what we are going to do is we're going to go through this with a fine-tooth comb, we're going to figure out where it's going wrong, and at the end of that process, at next year's budget, we're going to present a plan for cutting it back to a reasonable level, or something like that. Something that doesn't necessarily get ticked off by the OBR, but that expresses a kind of direction of travel that the bond market would have sympathy with, or we are going to get this in hand, kind of thing.
That's a really interesting question, because bond investors, what they care about is the stability of the government, economic growth, inflation. If the government presents a credible plan for how it can push all those numbers in the right direction, I think investors buying government debt would be open to that, and they would listen to that. But it's got to be credible. And one of the problems the government bumped up against already was where they tried to introduce some spending cuts, and they couldn't get it past their own party.
Yeah.
The two huge areas, aside from debt, the two huge areas of government spending are welfare and health, the NHS. Unless they can show some credible plans on how they can bring those government expenditure under control, I think they're always going to be fighting an uphill battle.
Yes, I mean it's just this is the point where I have sympathy for the people who want to get rid of the OBR. Although I realise an awful lot of people who want that are actually, they're doing it for reasons that are different to mine. It's the sense that if they didn't have someone taking their homework, they would get away with everything. But anyway, look, we're going to need to wrap up shortly, but one thing I did want to not let you leave without answering, Tom, was let's say we made you Chancellor for the day. If you had one thing on your wish list that you could just impose or push through, what would it be?
Yeah, off the cuff, right? So I think spending reform is I would actually look to reduce the size of the state as much as I could. I touched there on the welfare bill. It's ludicrously out of control, right? So we cannot put this country's finances back on a sound footing without bringing spending under control. So I would definitely put that very high on my shopping list.
It's terrible that's on your wish list, whereas it should actually just kind of be the sort of thing you think a Chancellor would immediately be thinking about as soon as they stand up. But
well, we are where we are.
Well, look, thanks very much, Tom.
All right, thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to follow me and Merryn on X/Twitter. That's Merryn's at MerrynSW, and I'm at John_Stepek. And what are you, Tom? People can follow you.
I'm at Pensions Monkey.
There we go. And this episode was produced by Summer Sadie and Moses Andam. Questions and comments on the show and all our shows are always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. And if you're not already a subscriber to Bloomberg, then I highly recommend that you do so. Go out to bloomberg.com/UK and you'll find subscription packages to suit you. Thanks.